very, very hard acts to follow, but I'm sure you'll manage.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sink and Judith, for preparing the ground and covering such a broad terrain and doing it so well. Those were indeed happy days, Judith. Happy days. The interesting thing about it, of course, was that when the tax was announced, your newspaper and mine editorialized in favor of it.
That'd be right.
And I had a dickens of a time getting that first column in, which said this tax is an absolute disaster. Very poorly thought through, never worked, punitive, expropriative, and so on. And of course, as you rightly said, the MRRT is in many respects even worse. The RSPT was a potentially good theory, very poorly applied. The MRRT was poor theory, poorly applied. And that's what, of course, we now live with. And that, then, of course, is especially important because here we are in this situation where we have a cash deficit in the order of 3% of GDP, and the government has to decide what it's going to do about that, how we're going to deal with that cash deficit. Now, we all know that a cash deficit or government deficit is simply a deferred tax. So it's not that it's for free. It's simply a way of postponing tax, typically inefficiently, to future taxpayers. And the issue that raises is that the best way of dealing with the current situation? And if it isn't, what sort of adjustments should be made? And I want to argue a proposition that I realize is a bit like trying to sing the merits of drugs, alcohol, and sex at a revival meeting. But I want to say, in the spirit of that Irish poet Sean Pugh, who wrote a book called Sing for the Taxman, a book of poems called A Song for the Taxman, and warmly recommend. I want to say a few words in favor of raising taxes.
Bring the rope.
Bring the rope. Why only the rope? She's been generous today, letting me off lightly. And the reason I want to do that is because I think it's important that governments face their responsibility. And what that means is that if they genuinely come to the view that they cannot make spending adjustments, or that those spending adjustments cannot be made sufficiently quickly, then I think honesty, prudence, and integrity require them to attempt to close the gap by increasing taxes and making the community therefore aware of the resources that government is commanding and consuming. And if they don't do that, then you, in many respects, perpetuate the fiscal illusion that Sinclair was talking about at the moment. And so I see that as important from an integrity and honesty of government point of view. And of course, it's also important if we are genuinely to eliminate the budget deficit. So it's not that I believe that eliminating the budget deficit is a goal that should be placed above all others. Clearly, that's not the case. But it is a very important goal, and it's a goal that the government needs to hold to. If it comes to the view that spending cuts are going to be unacceptable, or it can't find them, then let it have the honesty to face the consequence of that, which is that taxes must rise. Now, it's also true, as an empirical proposition, that if you look at fiscal consolidations internationally, there have been no successful fiscal consolidations that did not involve increases in revenues. And one of the reasons for that is that government projections of spending cuts are, and of sort of savings consequences are notoriously unreliable and almost invariably substantially overstated. And there's a lot of errors that have been made in the economic literature on fiscal consolidation and what happens in fiscal consolidation that reflects those errors. So for instance, there's a frequently cited paper by Libertarian that from Harvard that claims that if you look at a series of fiscal consolidations, the successful ones had much, much larger spending cuts than revenue increases. The problem with that paper is that what happened in it was that Alessina and his co-author relied on budget statements of expected savings from spending cuts and from revenue increases. But when you looked at outturns, the outturns in terms of the spending cuts were always smaller, always much, much smaller. And the result was that much, much more of the weight was borne by revenue increases. Indeed, you take the case that they focus on very heavily, which is the Finnish consolidation of the early 1990s, where about 60% of the turnaround was expected to or projected to come from spending cuts. Ex post, only 10% of the fiscal consolidation actually came from spending cuts. And on an outturn basis, 90% of it came from revenue increases. Now, from a public welfare point of view, that's hardly desirable, but at least they had the courage to actually tackle the shortfall that they faced. So that then raises the question of how you do that and what the best way of doing that is. And there are no good ways of raising taxes for all the reasons that Sinclair pointed to and that Judith elaborated on in the specific case of the MRRT. And so, are there some that are slightly less terrible than others? Is the only real question that you can ask. Now, I think some of them are really bad and very costly and should be avoided. So, the one that I would put up there as absolutely horrible, not because I think it's immoral, but because I think it's terribly inefficient and in the long run sense very dangerous, is a lot of what is being done internationally in the company tax area. So really attempts by the advanced economies to form a tax cartel and try to shoehorn international taxation arrangements that technology and globalization have broken down, try to shoehorn them into the confines defined by this tax cartel. And to my mind, it's truly lamentable that though Tony Abbott, in a speech in Davos a couple of months ago, quite rightly emphasized the need to preserve international tax competition as we seek greater tax integrity, and he was absolutely right to do that. In practice, our government is an integral player in these efforts at creating a tax cartel of the advanced economies and forcing high company tax rates too on lower income economies. And that, in my view, is both extremely inefficient and in the long run very dangerous because those taxes are so opaque. What about the GST as an alternative that is frequently mentioned? Well, look, the GST is not the worst tax we have, but I'm very wary of what, breaking into my years of French, I would call the platitude du jour, that increasing the GST and broadening its base is the solution to our tax woes, and a very low-cost solution at that. Take broadening the GST base. Clearly, there are good arguments for including food, but what about education and welfare, education and health services? Well, the basic problem there is that these are sectors that where you have public providers that provide services at a zero charge and private providers that provide services at a charge. If you impose the GST, it will fall on the private sector and not on the public sector. And it will distort provision and reduce the competitive constraints on public sector providers. Moreover, it makes very little sense when you think about it. These are activities that we subsidize very heavily. It doesn't make sense to provide enormous subsidies and then impose a tax on one part of provision only. So that base broadening, which as I say has become the platitude du jour, is in my view very ill-conceived. It's also an illusion to believe that the GST is in a fundamental economic sense different from an income tax. In a competitive economy, the revenue base of the GST is identical to that of the income tax. And the consequences of the GST, other than the fact that it's relatively flat, which is a good thing, are identical to those of an income tax in the long run. So that really then leads you to the personal income tax, and I'll close on that. Well, to my mind, what they should do is, if they really need to increase taxes, is they should reduce the tax-free threshold for the income tax, and exactly, and ensure that that every Australian should face some cost for the goods and services they want government to provide. It doesn't make sense in a democracy to have a system where very, very large numbers of people are not actually required to contribute to the cost of goods and services that they seek the government to provide. I recognize that that's politically difficult to do, but you could do it in a way that manage many of those issues, right, by, even if you introduced it at a relatively low rate, with all the complexities that involve, and even if you imposed, if necessary, a slightly higher rate at the top as a temporary measure, I would still prefer that to simply allowing the deficits to run on, never tackling the problems, never really messing up to the Australian people about the need to fundamentally get our fiscal house in order.